Hello and a warm welcome to everybody to this edition of the German-Italian Dialogues. Today we have another personality with an international background and therefore decided to do our talk again in English in order to give even the larger European and international public the opportunity to follow our talk. Today we will talk to Professor Carlo Cottarelli, well-known economist, former director of the International Monetary Fund, commissioner for the review of public expenditure in Italy, and founder and director of the Osservatorio of Public Expenditure in Italy, hosted at the Catholic University of Milan. Carlo Cottarelli is for sure one of the most experienced experts of Italian economy and financial situation, and therefore I'm very glad that he followed our invitation and I have the opportunity to talk to him today. Welcome, Carlo.
Hello, good morning, Carlo. Thank you very much for your time. I think we have a lot of topics to discuss today. The corona crisis has far-reaching and dramatic consequences for Italy, as Italy was hit really already in a situation of, difficult economic situation, as Italy has never really recovered already from the other crisis that we had 2008 and ongoing. So right now the economic climate is characterized by restraint, skepticism, and so the prospects for the recovery are already bleak. So what is your perspective for Italy's economic and social and political future, and how can Italy right now overcome the crisis?
You're right. Italy entered this crisis from a position that certainly was not very strong. 2019 ended the worst 20 years in Italian economic history since 1861, when Italy was formed as a unitary state. There was Italy's GDP, per capita GDP, started growing less rapidly than in other euro area countries already soon after the entry in the euro area. It reached a peak in 2007, and since then there were two crises, and in spite of some recovery between 2014 and 2019, in 2019 per capita GDP was at the same level as it was 20 years before, and below the peak reached in 2007. So the starting point was not very good, and this clearly showed that we have some structural problems, severe structural problems, that pre-existed the pandemic crisis. Then, of course, the pandemic crisis hit Italy in a particularly strong way. For a number of reasons, one would have to assess carefully after the issue needs to be studied carefully. But certainly one thing that was problematic in Italy is that we have an older population, and so we suffer tremendously in terms of casualties from the coronavirus crisis. So we suffer more than other countries from the crisis in terms of health, from a health perspective. In terms of GDP, the drop in the first quarter was similar to the one experienced by Spain or France, much worse, however, than in Germany. If we look at the projections made by international organizations regarding Italy's GDP this year, however, we see that Italy is seen to be at the bottom of all European countries, Euro area countries, and European countries except Greece. The projected decline in GDP this year ranges from -8%, that's the government projection, to -14%, that's the OECD projections, and in between, let's say close to -10%, you have the IMF. Actually, the IMF now is -12% or more, You have the OECD, some projection of the OECD. You have the European Commission, again, more than 10%. You have the European Central Bank. Bank of Italy itself has two scenarios. One, the baseline scenario is -9. The worst case scenario is -13. So we're talking about huge numbers. This will be the largest decline in Italian GDP since 1945, when Italian GDP collapsed because of the Second World War, of the disaster of the Second World War. So we had a health sector crisis, we had a GDP crisis. We did not yet, fortunately, experience a third crisis, a financial crisis, which would have made the decline in GDP even stronger. The financial crisis comes from the fact that Italy's deficit is rising very fast this year. There is a need for the government to borrow more to support the economy. But Italy started 2020 with a very high public sector debt, and therefore it was more difficult. It is more difficult. It was more difficult, let's say. Then let's see what happened. It was more difficult for Italy to borrow. And the possibility of a financial crisis was apparent in the first weeks of the coronavirus crisis. In early March, interest rates on Italian long-term debt, 10 years BTP, exceeded 3%, while at the beginning of the year it was below 1%. And it started rising very rapidly when, at one point in early March, it appeared that the European Central Bank were not willing to intervene sufficiently to calm down financial markets. So that's when a financial crisis appeared to be on its way, which would have been a complete disaster for Italy and for Europe. Thanks to the European institutions, the risk of this crisis, at least for the moment, dropped dramatically. The Italian BTP, 10-year BTP rate is now 1.3%, still higher than in Spain or Portugal or France, but entirely sustainable. And this is thanks, first and foremost, this year to the intervention of the European Central Bank, the announcement that the pandemic, that will be a new quantitative easing program will be introduced to this pandemic crisis program, which would involve very large financing for the whole euro area, including Italy. In addition to this, financial markets must have appreciated the willingness of the European institutions to step in with additional funds, the sure financing line to finance essentially unemployment benefits in the EU, the ESM, the new health credit line of the ESM, the funds made available by the European Investment Bank. And eventually, if there is a political agreement for next year, we will have also the resources from the Recovery Fund, or as it is now called, the Next Generation EU plan. This has helped a lot, and there are still many uncertainties that remain, but for the moment it seems that the risk of a financial crisis has been averted, which is good news. Situation remains very uncertain. We'll see next year. Next year, I hope there will be an agreement on the next generation EU plan. What is critical, however, is at this point Italy uses well these resources, because it's not enough just to get out of this crisis. What we need is to go to levels of GDP growth of at least 2% per year. Over the last 10 years, Italian GDP growth rate was 0.2% per year. In Germany, it was 2%. So Germany did in 1 year what Italy did in 10 years. And of course, this would makes sustaining public debt more difficult. So we must introduce reforms. We must introduce reform rapidly to raise our GDP growth rate to at least 2% per year. So something we have not been able to do so far.
Yeah, I think with this perspective for the reforms, you addressed in the last years repeatedly that reforms are needed in several parts of Italian economy, society. You named them the 7 deadly sins of Italy economy, like tax evasion, corruption, excessive bureaucracy, slowness of justice, the demographic trend, and the contrast between North and South. So right now that we have, or that maybe it's the chance given that thanks to the big financial helps that are provided or can be used, even Italy could use them for more general and more deep transformation. And yeah, what would your roadmap be for Italy?
Well, the roadmap, it is important, it is critical to have a roadmap. If I have to criticize the government, so far it's not clear what the roadmap is going to be. There are some elements of a roadmap, but not yet a clear strategy. Having a strategy means having priorities. You cannot have 50 priorities. For me, there are 3 priorities. One is the one that is needed immediately to get out of this crisis. The other 2, I will say in a moment what they are. The other 2 are needed to go back to move to a higher growth path. So in the first priority, immediate priority, obviously is to boost aggregate demand. The moment the drop in GDP is not so much due to lack of supply. People have been able to go back to work. It's lack of demand. So this is a typical Keynesian situation in which there is a need for the state to boost aggregate demand. The best way for me to do it in this situation of high uncertainty is through public investment. Why? Because transferring money to the private sector, for example, by cutting taxes, runs the risk of this money being saved to a large extent because of uncertainty. So there is a need for direct spending by the government, and public investment has one big advantage. We need better infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, and in order to do, and we also need to leave something to future generations. Investment is something good for future generations. That's the first priority. This would lift aggregate demand and close the difference between current potential output and actual output. But we also want to raise the potential output of the growth rate of the potential output of the Italian economy. And for this, I will move to the other 2 strategic priorities for me. One is the reduction of bureaucracy. And the other one is the justice system that works better. Why these 2? Because if we ask entrepreneurs what are the main disincentives to public investment in Italy, for years we heard the same stories. Bureaucracy and the slow pace of justice. Bureaucracy, by bureaucracy I mean 2 things. One is the excessive number of regulations, forms that need to be filled in, public agencies that needs to be consulted to have the permission to have an investment project. And the other one is how the public administration itself operates. On the first one, we have too many laws, too many regulations, many more than in Germany, even than in France, because we have also regional rules that are very different from one region to another. The second component, making the public sector work better, means essentially try to make the public sector work a bit more like a firm, like a private firm, in the sense that you need to work to produce something. You need targets of production, you need benchmark to assess whether you manage to achieve certain results. So each minister at the beginning of his or her mandate should clearly identify what are the deliverables. and be accountable for delivering those things. Stuff, very concrete stuff, like reducing the time that is needed for a surgical operation, reducing the times that is needed for to get an identity card, which is currently 6 months. It needs to be brought down to 6 days, not 6 months. Stuff like this is very concrete. Of course, for this to happen, you need to set targets, to monitor targets, but you also need adequate incentives within the public sector. At the moment, there are no incentives. There are no way of rewarding people in the public sector that do well their job. So this needs a reform of the public sector. Third element of the public investment, reform of the public sector, is one specific element of the public sector, the justice system. In Italy, commercial law controversies, commercial disputes, reaching to a conclusion in a court of law takes, for a commercial dispute, 4 times as long as in Germany. And of course, this creates a lot of uncertainty. The average length of a commercial law dispute is 8 years in Italy, if it reaches the 3rd level of jurisdiction. And of course, this is creates a lot of uncertainty about the rule of law, about whether a contract, a deal, a private deal is good or not. If it takes 8 years, you go to the judge, it takes 8 years to get a decision. And that's why the slow pace of justice and bureaucracy are at the top of the list of things that private entrepreneurs regard as the main disincentive for investing in Italy. So these are the 3 priorities: public investment, a public sector that works better and reduce bureaucracy, and the justice system that is faster. There are other things that are very important, but they would have an impact on growth that is more long-term. One of them, I mentioned one, is public education, public sector, the creation of human capital. Public education has been defunded in Italy for almost 15 years, from the very beginning, but also to university. In terms of kindergarten, we are public spending for kindergarten, we are the worst, one of the last places in Europe. But also university spending is one of the last places in Europe in terms of per capita spending for universities. So this is a very serious problem, because this is where you create human capital. And of course, these are the priorities. But let me mention one thing. It's very important that these priorities are realized taking into account other goals. When I talk about investment, I talk also about green investment. That's necessary. When I talk about the need to support to have better kindergarten spending, I have also in mind gender equality. All these things are very important. So these are my priorities. There may be others, but the important thing is that the government defines what the priorities are. Otherwise, if it tries to win battles on too many fronts, you end up losing battles everywhere.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because so you described and this full range of possibilities with altogether even a roadmap leading to the transformation in perspective of the so-called Agenda 2030. Which is even named by the European Commission, the goal for this term of the Commission. And I think this is right now even the opportunity. The Corona crisis is a great challenge for everybody, but a great opportunity for all the countries, for Italy, for Germany, to go and to reach out for the goals that you described right now. One last question right now, as we are talking about perspectives, European collaborations. Right now that we have started the German presidency of the European Council, what are your expectations for the German-Italian relationship in this term, that even in the perspective that next year in Germany we start with our electoral campaign, shortly after we will have in Italy. So right now it's even a great opportunity, as Italy right now is together with Germany, with France, the pillar of the European Union, how to establish and to foster this cooperation.
Yes. What Germany has done recently, what Angela Merkel has done recently regarding the recovery fund or the next generation EU plan is very important and is being perceived very favorably by many people in Italy. These are resources that will be made available for Italy to not only just get out of the current crisis, but also build a better future. Go back to a growth rate that has not been experienced in the last 20 years, so something like, as I mentioned, 2% per year is the minimum goal in my view. And for this, these resources are very important. These resources are very different from the mutualization of public debt that some people thought would be needed 10 years ago. This is not that mutualization. I think it would be inappropriate for other countries to take care of Italian public debt. Past Italian public debt has been generated by wrong economic policies. Here the story is different. Here the story is that Europe borrows money together and we decide together how to spend it. The money comes with conditions on how to spend it. And that's the way it should be, because if the money is borrowed together, then we need to decide together how to spend it. It's not very different from that mutualization, but very important in this moment. I think the European Union and the European countries are playing a different role than 10 years ago. Of course, Europe is moving still much more slowly with respect to, say, the United States, but that's because we don't have the United States of Europe. The United States of America, there is a central government, there is a parliament that can take final decisions, there is a European budget that is 20 times as large as the EU budget. This decision that has been taken to create a next generation EU plan goes in the right direction. There is still a lot to be built, but definitely goes in the right direction. Unfortunately, in Italy, there is still a lot of skepticism regarding, by the majority of the population, towards Europe and towards Northern European countries. I think that this feeling is fueled by the fact that Italy's economy has not gone very well over the last 20 years, and we tend to blame others instead of blaming ourselves. I wrote this book about the 7 capital sins of the Italian economy, not to argue that everything that was done by other countries was right. There were many mistakes that were made by France, Germany, but definitely we are primarily responsible for our own problems. But this is difficult to acknowledge, and so this is why there is a feeling of hatred will be too strong, but certainly people are not as supportive of Europe as they were 30 or 40 years ago. And I'm very worried about this because the economic situation remains very uncertain. As I said, there won't be a crisis, I believe, this year, perhaps even next year, but over the medium term, if we don't manage to grow by 2% per year, not 0.2% per year as we've done over the last 10 years, then the gap between Italy and other European countries is going to be deeper and deeper. And there may be other crises. So in that situation, the anti-European feelings may become even stronger. Very worried by this, and that's why it is very important that Italy gets out of this crisis as soon as possible. Over the next few quarters, certainly by the end of 2021, we should aim at having recovered the loss that we suffered this year. And this will go back to where we were in 2019. And from there, we start going faster.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the perspectives remain critical for Italy, for Germany, for the whole EU, because many of the things which are right now not foreseeable, like you mentioned at the very beginning, a possible second wave of the pandemic, we don't know yet. I think that is pretty clear what should be done to overcome the crisis, and we just hope that we can add to the EU Recovery Fund, the Green Deal, even this recovery of the idea of Europe in order to work and to cooperate more intensely together. Thank you very much, Carlo, for your time, for your talk, for your insights. We will, of course, give even the possibility to see and to follow on your website. And yes, many thanks and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.